Let me hit record. Uh, so I want to talk for a little bit, and then we'll have time to practice together, and then hopefully we'll also have a little open time for conversation or questions, that kind of thing. So, mindfulness is often introduced as a way to reduce stress or improve sleep or lower blood pressure or manage anxiety, and it certainly can do all those things. There's now decades of research that support the benefits of mindfulness for both physical and psychological well-being. But mindfulness is also about something deeper than improving, symptoms and conditions, as important as that is. But it's also about living what we would say is an intentional life that's rooted in love and compassion. That's at the heart of the practice, really. And it's okay if that's not why you're practicing mindfulness, but I want you to know that it offers this deeper kind of aspect of a way of living life. So today I'd like to just briefly reflect on what it means to live mindfully in such a way as to live with more intention, purpose, and love for this one life that we've been giving. If we become more present and more compassionate in our lives, how might that give something back to the world also? There's a saying that's widely attributed to the theologian and civil rights leader Howard Thurman, where he says, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Although scholars have not found a definitive published source for these exact words of Thurman, it's definitely comes across, the sentiment itself comes across in his writings, other writings, and his life's work, really. So I don't want to suggest that you should be doing more for the world in that kind of quantifiable way by making a big splash, or creating a long list of accomplishments. But what I want to say is that one of the most important things we can do for the world is to be present in a loving, compassionate way, so that our lives become more life-giving, not only for ourselves, but for others. Or as Thurman would say, to become a person who has come alive. Several years ago on a retreat I attended with John Kabat-Zinn, he described a time in his life when he was wrestling with what he called his job with a capital J. He said that this question became a kind of personal koan or riddle. And it was not simply a career question for John. It was not about, where is he going to get his paycheck from. It was about his deeper purpose, his particular contribution that only he has to offer, his unique way of serving the world. And these are important questions for all of us. We might ask ourselves, what makes me come alive? What is my capital J job? Why am I here? How am I living? What is my purpose, my vocation, my reason for getting up in the morning? Many of us have thought about this and visited this kind of consideration and these questions, but it's always good to come back to it at this point now in my life. And reflecting on these kinds of questions reminds us that the practice of mindfulness is not for just me alone. Yes, as I said, mindfulness can help reduce your anxiety and lower your blood pressure and help with chronic pain and increase your focus. And I hope you experience those benefits, but also it helps you to go out into the world in a particular kind of way. So it's worth considering what it is you have to give to this world. And that doesn't have to be grandiose. Your offering can be found in your everyday experiences. How can I bring more kindness into my family? How can I serve my community? How can I use whatever gifts I have to make the world a better place in some way? Maybe that means becoming more fully myself, not in kind of egoic sense, but in the sense of becoming the person I was created to be. Another, I think, important and related question to ask is what gets in the way of us looking at the big picture, the capital J job that is only ours to offer? What keeps us in that more kind of micro view of our lives? One way to look at it through the lens of mindfulness is that we get caught up in judgment. And judgment by design is a narrow field of view. Seeing the big picture requires an expansive view. I've said this many times here and in other places that the antidote to judgment is curiosity, because curiosity is an open-ended response rather than a narrow kind of knee-jerk reactive judgment. And we move from a simplistic, dualistic approach that sees only left and right, up and down, black and white, and we can move into a broad field of awareness, open to new possibilities and broader perspectives. The reactive, hyper self-focused state can turn into a kind of rumination. When we keep returning to this state of mind, it can become a pattern that kind of cuts a deep mental pathway in our brain, fortifying neural networks that keep us living in this state of self-referential thinking, the kind of I, me, and mine thinking. And that has us knocking around in our own heads, and that can easily become a habit of mind. Psychologists sometimes call this automaticity. In mindfulness, we often talk about it being on autopilot, and much of our lives is governed by habits, routines, assumptions, and conditioning, which isn't all bad or unhealthy. However, when this becomes an unconscious or mindless pattern, we start to believe the habitual thinking and act as if we have no other choice but to hold on to what some 12-step traditions call stinking thinking. We get caught in the negative of all that, hypervigilance. Modern neuroscience describes how the brain becomes conditioned. Researchers have identified a collection of brain regions called the default mode network. This network becomes especially active when our minds just drift into this self-referential kind of thinking, like replaying the past, rehearsing the future, worrying, comparing, judging, and getting overly caught up in the story of me. This default mode network, it's not wrong, it serves important functions, but when it takes over or becomes entrenched, we can spend large portions of our lives just kind of lost in thought instead of being present to a life that's always unfolding and renewing. Mindfulness practice reduces rumination by targeting that default mode network, strengthening our ability to notice when the mind has wandered into automatic narratives and offering a way to return to present moment awareness. And rather than eliminating our thoughts, mindfulness changes our relationship to them, giving us greater freedom in how we respond. Bhikkhu Analayo, who I've mentioned before, a Buddhist scholar, he frequently reminds us that mindfulness allows us to recognize the conditioned nature of our experience. Conditioned. We begin to see how habits, fears, preferences, and old narratives really end up shaping our lives. And once we see those patterns clearly, we're no longer completely governed by them. We get to choose our response. Awareness opens up the possibility of freedom from the tyranny of that default mode network. One psychological approach that resonates deeply with mindfulness and this idea is acceptance and commitment therapy. Sometimes you hear it, ACT, which emerged out of cognitive behavioral therapy. ACT teaches that psychological health is not about eliminating uncomfortable thoughts or feelings. Instead, it's about developing what researchers call psychological flexibility, the ability to remain open to experience while choosing actions that reflect your deepest values not just what comes up in the surface and in front of you all the time, allowing you to consciously choose the kind of person that you want to be. And research consistently shows that greater psychological flexibility is associated with better mental health, greater resilience, stronger relationships, and a greater sense of meaning in life. So rather than being controlled by our conditioning, we become increasingly capable of living according to what truly matters to us. So as we sit in meditation today, see if you can notice where you've been living in this kind of autopilot where things just come up and then you get pulled into it. Can you notice the rumination and the stories that the mind is telling? And can you see if there's a way to just release that, just even for the time of practicing this formal practice, so that you might see the big picture around what's the presenting issue right now in your life? So with that in mind, let's practice together. We'll sit with present moment awareness. And as you know, if you've been here before, that always starts with us checking in with our body. We call it mindfulness, but it's a full-bodied experience. So adjusting yourself in a posture that's relatively comfortable and also relatively grounded, or having a sense of groundedness, like getting your feet flat on the floor or your legs on the floor if you're sitting on the floor, and letting your hands come to rest on the thighs or gather together in the lap, so that there is also some releasing in the shoulders. And then closing the eyes or just softening your gaze down. And bringing your attention, your awareness to the breath, which is a handy tool for present moment awareness, to come back to the breath. This breath that's always changing, always renewing, and is always present. So we anchor our attention there, not in a stranglehold, but just when the mind goes off, when we notice it going off, returning it to the breath, this in-breath, this out-breath. And noticing how the mind wanders or gets caught in a line of thinking. And just acknowledge it and then gently guide the attention back to the breath. No fuss, no judgment. It's normal that the mind will wander. So we adopt this attitude of patience, curiosity, non-judgment. Where's the mind right now? Perhaps jumping ahead into the future, planning, worrying, or back in the past, regretting, reviewing. Just do your best to be here now in this moment, this one and only moment you have to live, moment by moment, so that you can be present to your own life, so that you can come alive. It's okay if your mind's moving around. We don't have to criticize that or get down on ourselves or on the practice. You just know that that is how the mind works. And we are just asserting a kind of gentle pressure to that so that we don't let it just carry us off somewhere. And that we can be present in this moment where anything's possible. Here's an excerpt from the poem Morning Offering by John O'Donohue. A place on the altar of dawn, the quiet loyalty of breath. May my mind come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. May I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more.